right, hello and welcome to the Diabetes Masterclass, Harnessing the Power of Your Breath. My name is Evan Soroka. I'm a certified yoga therapist, author of Yoga Therapy for Diabetes, and I am also a person living with type 1 diabetes. I've been type 1 since 1998, so about 23 years now. In sometime this fall, I'm not exactly sure the date of my diabetes diagnosis, but I have been living with diabetes and using yoga and predominantly breathing practices as an adjunct to my healthcare, especially with diabetes. And the purpose of this masterclass is to inform and to empower you to understand how to utilize breathing practices in your own personal diabetes self-care. So we're going to be going for about an hour. It's pretty hefty material, so I do recommend revisiting this. I'm going to be recording and sending everything out to all participants. And at the very end of practice, we'll have some time to, or at the very end of this lecture, we're going to have some time to do an experimental practice, as well as perhaps some Q&A. I hope we have some time. We might have to go over just a little bit for that. So I am going to share the screen here. Okay. All right. So welcome. As I mentioned, I'm a certified yoga therapist. I'm also an advanced registered yoga teacher. I've been teaching yoga since, I'm trying to even think, it's been about 15 years, but I've also been practicing yoga since I was 16 years old. So this is definitely a life practice for me. And I'm also the founder of Soroka Yoga Therapy based in Aspen, Colorado. We have quite a bit of bibliography of information, and these are some of the main sources that I've been working with for this presentation, specifically the work of Dr. Nick Heath, who is the breathing diabetic. You can follow him on Instagram, and we're actually doing an Instagram live this coming Thursday. So we're going to talk a lot about this information, as well as my teacher, Gary Crafso, Olga Calvel, who's got a wonderful resource called the Sequence Whiz. She's just created such a wonderful website there. You can check out her information, and as well as my book, Yoga Therapy for Diabetes. So I think the most important thing that we recognize is that breathing is not the antidote. It is a useful intervention and protection strategy when taking care of diabetes. So I'm going to go into what that means, because it's essentially twofold. We can practice interventions for any type of diabetes challenge. It's in the immediate tense. So this is our power to self-regulate and to adapt to changing circumstances and conditions. An example of this would be an intervention for working with, let's say, a blood glucose fluctuation, or an intervention if you're experiencing, let's say, some type of acute anxiety or stress, whether that's related to diabetes or it has some type of like related to diabetes would be like exactly from low blood sugar. That would be an example of exactly related to diabetes, or as a cause of diabetes, for instance, the relentless treatments and requirements that we have to deal with on a daily basis. An intervention strategy with breathing helps you shift your energetic condition. So our energetic condition is essentially how we feel energetically at any given moment. Sometimes we have a lot of energy, sometimes we don't have a lot of energy. And given upon how much energy we perceive that we do or do not have, this also impacts the quality of our perception and our willingness to, let's say, participate in life. A lot of times, if we're not feeling well, we're more likely to say no to things that we would otherwise say yes to. It is a practice of self-empowerment, and essentially it's all about autonomy. So doing a breathing practice on a daily basis when you're not feeling well, or even if you are feeling well, knowing that the benefit of consciously shaping your breath and working with your breath is going to help you feel more empowered, more efficacious, and it's also going to lead to long-term protection against the complications of living with diabetes. Even if you have a great A1C, bottom line is that fluctuations, blood sugar fluctuations do have an impact on a vascular level. And so there is, regardless of how well we're managing, there's always going to be some level of damage. So if we can use practices in the midst of challenges, it's going to help us in a longer term basis. In terms of prevention, this is a longer term. This is about protecting what is working. This is a strategy for us to build resilience. So resilience is our power to withstand challenges. It can be physiological challenges or psychological challenges, and to help us bounce back without a high level of deficit. So for instance, a resilience against, like, let's say a blood sugar challenge would be to be able to recover from hypoglycemia, which can be incredibly depleting, just as hyperglycemia can be, both physically and mentally exhausting, and to be able to bounce back with little to no ramifications or repercussions. And that's going to support our longevity, reducing our risk and improving our quality of life. And essentially what we're learning to do, I think with diabetes, we have a tendency to focus on what's wrong, what's going wrong, what's searching, where's my blood sugar at? What do I need to fix? And having a regular breathing practice as well as meditation, yoga practice is really a celebration of what's working well. What's working well is the fact that we're breathing, our heart is beating, our digestion is working, and when we can celebrate our body's health, what is working, we're less likely to focus on what's not working. Let's see here. Okay, this is a wonderful quote from my teacher's teacher, Swami Rama, who is well known for his work with controlling the breath and controlling the body's functions. He was known for being able to stop his heart and essentially put the body into what otherwise we would deem as not being alive, because the heart would stop. So he has this wonderful quote that I thought would really set the tone for this practice, is that controlling the breath is a prerequisite for controlling the mind and the body. And that's essentially what we're doing when we're consciously working with breath work. Oops. So yoga, we tend to think of yoga in a Western view as simply yoga postures or yoga movements, but really that's only one very small subsect of what yoga is. The definition of yoga is essentially skillfulness in action, and it's a tool or a means for us to move us from where we are to where we could potentially be, and that is the assumption that where we could potentially be is better than where we are. And one subsect of yoga, a full yoga practice, is pranayama, and this is what we call the breathing practices in Sanskrit. So prana in Sanskrit, it means the vital energy of the universe, and ayama signifies an expansion or an influence of this energy of the universe. So according to yoga, the yogi is one who influences prana within the body. And there's another quote from one of my teacher's teachers, so my grand teacher, TKV Deskachar, that the more content a person is and the better he or she feels, hence the energetic condition, the more prana resides within the body. So the more vitality, breath we have within our body, this is going to impact us on a multidimensional level, both physically, psychologically, and spiritually. And as we know, when it comes to diabetes, this is not all about dosing appropriately and giving yourself the perfect amount of insulin and exercising and diet. So much of this goes into the deeper realms of our relationship to ourselves and our relationship to the disease itself. So this segues into this idea that the breath is the connection between our body, our inner world, and in our outer world. And this is a concept that is very, I guess, seldom understood in a Western perspective, that we have a body, we have an inner world. We tend to think of our inner world as our thoughts, but this can also include our physiology, our anatomy, our musculoskeletal system. And if you look deeper, this would be like our intellect, and even the spiritual realms of understanding and consciousness. And the outer world is everything that we are identified and connected with, everything that's occurring outside of us that's also impacting our inner world. So we could say very often that, again, diabetes is something that is impacting or is impacted by both what's going on inside and what's going on outside. So an outside stressor, something as simple as exercise or some stressful occurrence that's happening in your life, whether that's directly associated with managing diabetes or something else, is going to impact what's going on in the body and in the mind, just as whatever's going on in the body and the mind, even blood sugar fluctuations and those kinds of things, are going to impact your perception of how you see the world. And so our breath is a key link to influencing this dynamic. I put these graphs here because I think it's important to recognize that an A1C has many faces. And so often when I asked all of the participants in this to mention what is your top goal, I would say majority of people say that their top goal is to get their A1C in range. But an A1C is very elusive. We could have an A1C under 7, which is the ideal recommendation to offset long-term complications. But just because we have an A1C of 7 doesn't mean that our time in range is adequate. We still could be, low all the time, or these great blood sugar swings that have a huge impact on our body's physiology and those adaptive responses that I mentioned, as well as increasing our heightened perception of stress. So it's very complicated. It's not just about the number, right? I think in very much in the way we view diabetes care or even medical care from a Western perspective is to treat what's wrong, as I mentioned before. So we're often treating, let's say in the circumstance of blood sugar, we're treating a high blood sugar or a low blood sugar, but we're not often looking at the causes. What are the causative factors behind that blood sugar swing? Is it behavioral? Is it some type of behavior that we continue to repeat that is perpetuating it? Sometimes that's rage bolusing. Sometimes that's fear of hypoglycemia, where people tend to run higher. Sometimes it's just an inadequate awareness of how to work with exercise and to reduce stress as well, because stress has a huge impact on our insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity. So there are many faces of what a good A1C will look like. And we can't just look at the results of an A1C to deem how well we're doing with diabetes. Because if we're looking at this as a longevity and health, any type of blood sugar fluctuation, any type of standard deviation that's really high, it's going to be damaging so many of our body's automatic or autonomic processes that help us to reestablish homeostasis. So the way we breathe, it greatly impacts the body, the mind, and the spirit. Dysfunctional breathing or inappropriate breathing, very often mouth breathing, hyperventilation, this perpetuates in a modern sense what's going wrong with a lot of people. It can ramp up the nervous system to be, let's just say, in more of a sympathetic state. And we're going to get into that in a little bit, but it pushes our body into more of a fight or flight situation. And this affects our brain quality, it affects cognition, it affects our perception of stress, increases anxiety, it's harder to breathe, we will experience our heart beating faster. And for many of us with diabetes and anyone with chronic stress in general, it makes it very difficult to unwind and to sleep. And all of this kind of perpetuates a vicious cycle of cause and effect. So whether that's accelerating other comorbidities, which are other diseases that are complications of diabetes, psychological disturbances, and a big factor with this is mouth breathing. There's a great book by James Nestor. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It's called Breath, and he goes into just a deep ethnography dive into how the structure of our face changes and all of the cascade of top-down effects and bottom-up effects. So the effects of the body and the mind and the body when we change the way that we're breathing. For so many of us, we breathe through the mouth. And even if we're not mouth breathing all the time, we are mouth breathing when we're pushing our body, especially in exercise. So working with the breath is going to really help to impact you on a multidimensional level. And then when it comes to diabetes care, or in diabetes health, irregularities in our breath, they can affect so many things that we're trying to stave off. So these are some examples. Heart disease is number one, autonomic neuropathy. And then when we look on the mental, emotional side of things, people with diabetes and all types of diabetes have a much higher incidence of developing any type of mental health disturbance, from anxiety, chronic anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, to depressive symptoms, and even clinical depression. People with diabetes have about a 50% higher chance than people without diabetes. And there are some studies saying, is it diabetes or is it diabetes that comes first, or is it depression that comes first, at least in type 2 individuals. But it seems that regardless, the correlation is there, whether it comes first, diabetes or depression. But I wrote about this in the book, but an ancient way of describing diabetes was it was caused by a lingering sadness. And that sadness, it kind of pushes into this realm of the spirit here in this next slide, this heavy burden. It's like a grief that we're living with at times, that despite our efforts, no matter what, we can't seem to get it right. And so working with our breath not only is going to help us to reestablish equilibrium, and it's going to promote more autonomy and let's just say balance between the ends of our nervous system and increase clarity and perception, but it really helps us on a spiritual level come to terms with our disease, with our diagnosis, and recognize that there is a part of us that is greater than the highs and lows, that there's a part of us that is always whole. And it's not just a conceptualization of, I know that I'm more than diabetes. It's truly an understanding, like a direct experience that I am not diabetes, I am something else, because the breath really helps to open those neural pathways to experiencing it. So I wanted to get into the physical realms because I think for a lot of us, this is where the majority of our understanding is and the majority of our curiosity is in terms of how the breath is going to help us. And the number one, let's just say the number one risk for long-term diabetes complications is something called hypoxia. Hypoxia, just like hypoglycemia, means an absence of. So it's a lack of sufficient oxygen to our cells. And so what happens for those of us with diabetes and with inadequate or dysfunctional breathing patterns, we're not getting enough oxygen to our tissues. And it's really not actually about breathing more, it's about breathing more efficiently. So carbon dioxide is something that is released when we exhale. But ironically, carbon dioxide is what helps us transport or get, and we're going to get into this more in a little bit, something called nitrous oxide, which is what helps oxygen enter into our lungs or into our cells. And so when we're not breathing efficiently or we're over breathing, for instance, our cells are not receiving the oxygen necessary, and there ends up being things like neuropathy, for instance. And so whether that's neuropathy of peripheral neuropathy affecting your feet, or if it's autonomic neuropathy that's affecting your nervous system and your digestion, those kinds of things, or heart disease, these are all things that we need to be able to stave off, and breathing is an effective strategy for us to be able to do that. So the autonomic nervous system, I'm not going to get too deep into this, but this is what regulates all of our body's organs. And our breath is directly associated with the function of our autonomic nervous system. So when we're breathing more, what we're going to find that is that certain systems are ramped up. And when we're slowing down our breath, certain systems are also, I guess, like suppressed and turned on. So depending upon what's more predominant, we're going to find that different organ systems of our body are either activated or suppressed. And in addition to our organ systems, what we want to consider as well is that the autonomic nervous system is directly associated with our brain, with our emotional responses, and in turn, our emotional responses, our behavior. So stress is a big part of the nervous system. When we are sympathetically activated, we tend to think that we're in a stress response. And the bottom line is that people with diabetes are more sympathetically activated, whether that's because of the fluctuations in our blood sugars, or if it's all of the daily requirements that we need to manage diabetes, or if it's due to autonomic neuropathy, as I was talking about. We have a tendency to be more in a sympathetic state, and there's acute activation of it. So that would be like our perception of stress, anxiety, any blood sugar fluctuation. Hypoglycemia is a great example of this. When we are sympathetically activated, this is our body's process to provide energy for immediate use. We need energy to respond to a threat. And because of that, it increases a natural production of glucose. And because of that, it can cause some level of insulin resistance. And for type 2 diabetes, it can be a causative factor, or the chronic activation of your autonomic nervous system, and the sympathetic branch can be a causative factor for developing type 2 diabetes. And with type 1 diabetes, like me, chronic activation of your sympathetic branch, it's really going to continue this perpetuation of insulin resistance, that the insulin that we inject is not working as efficiently. We want the insulin that we take, just as the insulin that those of you produce with type 2 diabetes, to work efficiently, so we can avoid lows as well. And the chronic activation, it's really, the problem is with this is that we're affected by our nervous system. When our nervous system is activated in a stress response, we're going to respond and see and perceive the outside world from a state of being on edge. So when we can't turn it off, this creates a pathway for developing things like anxiety and depression. It lowers our heart rate variability, which is essentially our nervous system's ability to adapt and respond to stressors without exhausting itself. That's kind of like a very loose way of describing it. It's much more in depth than that. and it can damage our autonomic nervous system. So once again, our body needs to be able to activate just as much as it needs to be able to downregulate. And when we're chronically activated, there's a lack of what we call parasympathetic tone. So the tone of our nervous system to be able to help our minds turn off, wind down, promote sleep, be less reactive. And it is in that parasympathetic state, which is the counterpart to the sympathetic state, where our body produces insulin. For those of you that still produce insulin, this is really an essential part of training your nervous system, is learning how to downregulate it. And you know, when we're chronically stressed, it's increasing inflammatory cytokines, increasing insulin resistance, and ultimately increasing risk. So I hope it's very, very clear that there's kind of like two different types of stress, just like we have intervention and prevention. Acute is in the now, chronic is the long term. So there are risks for both immediate and long term. And so, as I already mentioned, we spend more time in a sympathetic state, which can be due to fluctuations on our blood sugars, the management burden, and this hypoxia, this lack of circulation, or lack of oxygenation of our cells. So one of the major benefits of breathing and what we call nasal breathing versus mouth breathing, and this is like one of the main principles that I'd like you to grasp, is that by changing the way you're breathing and focusing on breathing through your nose, you're going to be promoting health on a multidimensional level. The main benefit, at least on a physical level, is that when you're breathing through your nose, your sinuses are producing something called nitrous oxide. And as I mentioned before, this is what is responsible. It's the gas that's responsible for helping to open ourselves. It's a vasodilator. And so just like insulin is to glucose, like a transporter that brings glucose out of our bloodstream and brings it into our cells, nitrous oxide does that with oxygen. And so it can, breathing through your nose regularly can help reduce or even reverse some of this chronic tissue hypoxia that many of us are dealing with when living with diabetes. Another thing that nasal breathing can help us do, and this is really important in terms of the psychological and behavioral changes, is that when we're breathing through the nose, it helps to light up parts of our brain, specifically the olfactory bulb. And this is the origin of our limbic system. When the limbic system, it's basically structurally and functionally the location between your impulse brain, so your more primitive brain, that it functions on survival, and the part of your brain that is like your prefrontal cortex, which helps you have more discernment and choice in your decisions. So what breathing through your nose does is it lights up the olfactory bulb, which is traced to the origin of the limbic system. And what this helps you do is to regulate emotion, memory, learning, but it also gives you, let's say, more autonomy. Again, this is really important, to be in charge of your decisions and to be more measured. So an example of this would be like, let's say you've already treated hypoglycemia and you're in those 15 minutes where you just feel very uncomfortable and everything in your body is telling you need to eat more, but you already know that you've done what you need to do, and you're able to directly tell your brain, okay, I'm okay. And so instead of reacting, you're able to respond by resting. And so the ancients knew this, the ancient yogis knew this, and they developed specific pranayama practices, breathing through the nose, different breath ratios to promote and balance emotions, clarify our mental processes, and integrate into one efficient functioning whole. And another definition of yoga is to yoke and to unite. And really this is what it's all about, is being the master of your domain. Okay. So another thing I hear so much from people, and I understand this because this is something that I deal with too, with diabetes. I mean, it's huge. Is it's sleep problems. I sigh because like last night my pump woke me up like maybe 2 or 3 times. I'm looking at it now, but I just a few different alarms, right? And again, when we looked at that model of what an A1C looked like, what does 7% look like? Is it lots of spikes or is it more of a flat line? You know, the more fluctuations, the more disruptions, the more alarms that are going off, but also the more disruption and dysfunction in your nervous system, the higher likelihood that you're going to wake up in the middle of the night or have a hard time falling asleep. So nasal breathing helps move our nervous system from the sympathetic, which is again, a heightened sympathetic state would be like a fight or flight, but it's any time that we're being active in our day, and moves us towards the parasympathetic, which is our rest and digest, where our body builds and regenerates and produces specific hormones that help to regulate our circadian rhythm as well. So it's essential. And when we're chronically sympathetically activated or predominant, it disturbs our breathing. And so by using our breath, this helps us promote more sympathetic tone. And diabetics have less parasympathetic tone, higher sympathetic activity, but less sympathetic tone, meaning it's really hard for us to downregulate. It's really hard for us to relax. Not only because of blood sugar fluctuations, but because, again, of everything that goes into taking care of diabetes. It's incredibly invasive, guys, and I'm not excusing it. I'm just giving you an idea that what we're working with is a lot. And so we need to understand what we're working with so we can move it in a direction that's going to be more beneficial for us. So by breathing through your nose regularly and using pranayama practices is going to help you to find more balance in your circadian rhythm, help you feel more rested, present, reduce brain fog. And it's going to help with something that hopefully you're not dealing with, but would affects a lot of people, which is sleep apnea. And sleep apnea is essentially where there's an obstruction of your breath when you're sleeping, and this can force us awake, or essentially like you're basically choking. You can't sleep, and it's directly impacting your nervous system, and it can be a causative factor for many other comorbid disorders, including insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, and heart disease. So by sleeping and having our mouth closed while we sleep, this can also help reverse sleep apnea. And I'm going to go in through some other methods, but before we do, just a really quick review. And I haven't gone through all of these, but these are the major benefits of doing pranayama practices and breathing through your nose. So number one is nitrous oxide production. And another benefit of nitrous oxide production beyond promoting more oxygen entering our cells and reducing the long-term complications of neuropathy, for example, is that by breathing through your nose, the nitrous oxide production that's produced in your paranasal sinuses, it's an antifungal, antiviral, and antiparasitic, and as well as antibacterial. So if we think about a lowered immune system and higher risk, this is really a wonderful strategy that we can utilize to promote better immunity. Not only that, but breathing through your nose, our lungs are not primed to breathe through the mouth. We need the air to be moisturized and warmed. And so by breathing through your nose, this prepares the air for your lungs, and it cleanses the air from dirt and other pathogens. It helps us to regulate the flow of our breath. So again, I talked about over breathing is also something that can induce sympathetic activation. Slowing down the breath helps us to promote more of a parasympathetic activation. And then in addition, this helps to maintain the health of our lungs and throat. And with sleep apnea, the destruction of the throat and the tissues there can be a cause of that as well, especially if you're mouth breathing a lot. And the nose is a really magnificent organ, if you haven't already discovered this from this lecture thus far. But what happens is that this is the prime regulator of the nervous system. So it has a direct connection to our autonomic nervous system and our nasal cycle. So I think it's about every 2 hours, the predominance between our nostrils changes, moving from sympathetic when the right is more predominant and parasympathetic when the left is more predominant. So specific breathing practices can help you to consciously regulate that, but it helps us to impact our blood temperature, our body temperature, blood pressure, hormone production, and mood as well. And there's so many benefits to all of that. Okay, so there are so many ways that we can train ourselves to breathe through our nose. One is Ujjayi Pranayama, and Ujjayi Pranayama is what we traditionally practice in any type of yoga practice, whether that's a seated breathing practice, or if it's your asana practice, or what we would think of typically as yoga in the Western perspective, where we're doing lots of postures, etc. If you go to yoga class, you should be focusing on Ujjayi Pranayam, and that is the valving of the throat. Again, this is controlling the rhythm and the rate at which you're breathing. So as you're moving through your sun salutations, as you're holding a pose and focusing on the breath should always be at the forefront of your attention. How you're breathing is influencing how you feel. It's also influencing how you're moving and shaping your body into all of these postures. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of lip service to how to breathe in a yoga practice. So what I do recommend the next time you do go to a yoga class, or you could go to one of my classes on my website or on Yoga International, is really to focus on keeping your breath at an even rate and breathing from the valve in your throat. So you're going to have your mouth closed, but what you're doing is creating this ocean-like sound. Let's see if I can do a couple. And doing that at all times. When you notice that you're hyperventilating or overbreathing, that's an indication to back off and to come back to your breath. You know, like sometimes we push it too hard, whether that's an exercise or our physical yoga practice, and we're not breathing. And according to every master that I've studied under, the moment you stop breathing, essentially it stops being yoga. And as we've learned thus far, it can be very detrimental to our physical body as well. So if you want to up the game in your yoga practice, I highly recommend breathing from, you're breathing through the nose, but it's from the throat. It's not this. That creates hyperventilation, but by focusing on the Ujjayi valve in your throat, that's really going to help you find more ease with your breath, as well as alternate nostril breathing. And these are techniques that are experienced and they're taught. It's not all breathing practices are beneficial for all times. Some can be too stimulating. Some can be anxiety provoking. So we want to learn how to breathe under someone trained. In the series that's coming up at the end of the month, the breathwork series, we're going to be going through 5 classes about how to work with all these different types of breath with each class. So you're going to get a direct understanding of how to use, how to apply them. Another strategy, it's so simple. It's just to pay attention throughout your day to how you're breathing. Noticing, are you breathing through your mouth? When you do, you just close your mouth and come back to your breath. It's as simple as that, just like you would train your posture, pay attention to it. Another thing that I personally do, and that you might even consider doing, it's not easy. It's not easy to, I guess, maintain, but it is a great way to train, and it is simple, is to keep your mouth closed during exercise. Okay, so this helps promote more efficiency from overbreathing. Overbreathing taxes our nervous system. It increases glycogen production. So glycogen is the hormone that increases our blood sugar. And when we're breathing efficiently through the mouth, it puts us more into an aerobic state where we're burning fat. So if you're having a hard time maintaining energy while you're exercising, this can be a great training for you as well. As well as if you're experiencing lows. Now, the only caveat with this is that if you have insulin on board or too much insulin, active insulin on board during exercise, you're going to get low no matter what you're doing, whether it's anaerobic or aerobic exercise. But if you don't have insulin on board, focusing on how you're breathing is a great way to train your body, train your lungs, especially to be more efficient. So whether you're a competitor and you want to be really good for competition, or whether you just want more efficiency and you want to be less tired after exercise, paying attention to this is very helpful. Overbreathing creates more stress, and even exercise is stress. There's positive stress and negative stress, but if you're always hyperventilating when you're breathing, pushing yourself, you're going to be depleting yourself and taxing your nervous system. So that kind of segues into the second thing that I'd like you to focus on in terms of what you can do to change the way that you're breathing and harness the power of your breath. The first was nasal breathing, and the second is nasally breathing, but doing it slowly. So studies show that if we can bring our breath rate down to about 6 breaths per minute, that's about 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, it has dramatic neurological, metabolic benefits. It moves our nervous system from the sympathetic predominance to the parasympathetic, and it helps to decrease the hormones that naturally produce glucose, so glycogen, for instance. And for those of you with type 2 diabetes, this helps produce your natural insulin. For those of us with type 1, I mean, maybe you still have been able to maintain some beta cell production. I applaud you, but if you're like me and it's like you're 23 years in, there's no production happening. At least what you can do is slow breathing is help your nervous system be more adaptive and to increase the oxygenation of your cells. So there are very simple strategies that we can use to develop a slow breath with Ujjayi, that breath that we use from the throat, where we're essentially breathing through the nose, but we're using that valving of the throat to control the rate at which we're breathing. One is something called Samavriti Pranayama. Another name for this is square box breathing. You see that in more of like biohacking terminology, where we're doing an equal breath in and equal breath out, or an equal breath in, equal pause, equal breath out, and equal pause. Again, this should be comfortable. It should never be forced. The moment we're forcing our breath, it's pushing our nervous system into a realm that we don't necessarily want to be pushing it into, creating more stress. Another is abdominal diaphragmatic breathing. There are benefits to breathing into your chest. So I want to be clear. There's a lot of rhetoric out there that you're never supposed to breathe into your chest. There is a lot of benefit for breathing into your chest. But in this instance where you're just focusing on breathing into your belly, it is a great strategy for moving the nervous system into the parasympathetic. So focusing on a shape change and bypassing this shape change in your chest and moving it down into the abdomen. I'll notice with my clients and my private students, especially when we work on unobstructing the breath, for a lot of people that are chronically stressed, their breath tends to be locked up here, and it's really hard for them to move the breath into the belly. If you have a hard time accessing the belly breath and kind of like not turning this off, my recommendation is actually to lie on your stomach even stick like a pillow or there's like inflatable, just really gentle, they're called Gertie balls, inflatable ball into your stomach so you can have some proprioceptive awareness of what's going on and direct your breath there. And doing that for 5 minutes can be a great strategy for retraining your nervous system, preparing you for sleep at the end of the day, and those kinds of things. The last strategy, at least on a physical level, I mean, this is all physical, mental, energetic, spiritual, but is pushing your breath a little bit. And when I mean pushing, I don't mean moving towards strain or hyperventilation, but actually working on breath holds and stressing your breath out a little bit. So whether that's holding your breath out or holding your breath in within the parameters of not pushing towards hyperventilation can be a useful strategy for retraining your nervous system if there is damage to your nervous system. Or also, I guess you could say, in addition, even if there isn't damage, to help promote this resilience and longevity. So working with breath holds, whether that's on the inhale and the exhale, you can see there's a breath ratio chart. Different types of breathing have different energetic effects. I do not recommend working with breath holds unless you're under the guidance of someone who knows what they're doing, as well as until you're able to breathe through your nose efficiently without strain. So we don't want to build a house without a strong foundation. We don't want to push the parameters of training our breath unless we've got a strong foundation that is established with Ujjayi. And in more, I guess, like esoteric values of yoga, which is essentially the goal is to achieve consciousness, working with breath holds are a powerful way of altering your nervous system to open and expand consciousness and awareness. Another strategy as well, another benefit, I guess you could say, for holding your breath out, as you can see in the gentleman in the picture who's sucking his navel, and this is called Uddiyana Bandha, is it can be helpful for working with things like autonomic neuropathy, or if you have something called gastroparesis, which is it's an autonomic neuropathy essentially, where your stomach doesn't release food in a timely manner. It can be very difficult to manage diabetes with that. So there's great strategies to work with. Okay, so I thought we would do just like a brief breathing practice to experience some of these things that I'm talking about. So I think we're going to start with, we're going to do a couple of them. We're going to start with just some simple Ujjayi. And then we're going to do a box breathing exercise. And then we're going to do an alternate nostril breath. And this whole thing, I mean, it's going to take us about to the end of the hour. Okay, so let me just stop the share really briefly. And just take a moment, maybe stretch out a little bit. Few shoulder rolls. I recommend sitting in a chair, especially if you're sitting on the ground and you're not prepared. It can round the spine, so you really want to be sitting up nice and tall and long. Okay. So this is the way that I teach Ujjayi Pranayam to a beginner, and it's helpful even if you're not a beginner. We're going to do it actually through the mouth at first. And so what I want you to experience is shape change. Okay, so you're going to open your mouth and exhale. And as you exhale, Feel your abdomen compressing in. Now keep your mouth open and inhale. I want you to experience the shape change in the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. Okay, so as I mentioned, breathing through the nose moisturizes your breath. Can you feel it's dry with just those two breaths? Maybe it's me. I'm in Colorado and it's like 6% humidity. I'm sure that sounds really nice if you're living in humidity, but it's very dry. So now I want you to try to create that same sound, but with your mouth closed, okay? So it kind of feels as if your lungs are initiating here. Now we're going to work with that, okay? So I invite you to close your eyes so you can see your breath with your inner eye. Just go ahead and deepen your breath slowly. You don't have to start off deep. I would say start off at like 50% of your breath capacity. And experience the lungs expanding front, sides, and back. And at the end of the inhale, you'll experience as well, your navel will kind of pop out. On the exhale, the navel will draw in. What happens is the diaphragm lifts and the breath moves out of the body. Another benefit to breathing is it propels you to observe the present moment. It requires you to. So as you breathe, observe the feeling of your breath as the feeling of the present moment. And you'll notice there's thoughts, there's physical sensations. Simply breathing with ease, not trying to change anything, except if you're noticing tension in your breath. That's the only thing I'd like you to change, is to keep the breath even and at a rate that feels good. Now I'd like you to extend your breath to about 60 to 75%. And what I recommend you considering as you're doing this is you're not breathing in more, you're simply slowing your breath down. So rather than taking in your inhale all at once or pushing your exhale out all at once, you're slowing down the rate at which you're breathing. Again, if tension arises, that's an indicator you're pushing too hard or straining in some way. Ask yourself what you can do differently. Now either stay with this or see if you can go to about like 95. I want to say like a comfortable maximum. I don't want you to be pushing it to your maximum, just a little bit further. Comfortable maximum. The inhale and exhale are even. Please relax the shaping of your breath and just take a normal breath in and out. And notice that there is some level of change. Pranayama is an influencing of your life force. And the yogi is one who contains the life force in the body. So you might notice that you've changed some level of how you feel. Maybe the mind feels a little bit more focused. So that's simple Ujjayi. Now we're going to do a box breath, which is an equal inhale, pause after the inhale, exhale, and pause after the exhale. So we're going to work with 5 counts on each, and we're going to do 6 rounds of it. Okay, so still using Ujjayi. Please close your eyes again if you've opened them. Exhale. Inhale for the count of 5. Hold for 5. Exhale 5. And hold out for 5. Relax. Inhale 5. Hold 5. Exhale 5. Hold 5. Inhale 5. Hold 5. Exhale 5. Hold 5. Inhale 5. Hold 5. Relax the shoulders. Exhale 5. Feel the navel draw in. Hold 5. Last one. Inhale 5. Hold 5. Exhale 5. Hold 5. Now please take a normal breath in and a normal breath out. Observe the effect of what you just did. It's a little different. The breath holds add an extra layer of effect. Tradition says that pranayama removes the obstacle covering the mind from seeing clearly. Now, the last technique I'm going to do briefly is an alternate nostril breath. Now, the way that we do an alternate nostril breath is by closing one nostril. Here, I'll mirror you because although you're probably watching this, it's the same. So this is my right hand. The way I see it is reverse. This is my right hand. I'm going to close my right nostril with the thumb. And I'm going to use my ring finger to valve. Just like we use a valve in the throat, when we use an alternate nostril breath, we want to create the valve now at the nose. And this is really an important step that many people miss. Even if you Google it, you're going to see people like doing this. And it's not as efficient. Let's just put it that way. So you're going to close your right nostril and with your ring finger, valve the left. And you can't see, but I'm going to exhale out my mouth first. And close my mouth and inhale through the left nostril. I'm applying a little pressure, and if it's clogged, what you can do is just kind of pull the nasal passage open. That helps. Now to switch, you're going to close the left. Do the same now with the right and exhale out the right side. Okay, if you're comfortable, close the eyes. We're going to do
Just a couple rounds of this. Inhale through the right. Prana moving into the brain. Now close the right and exhale out a valve to left nostril. Inhale left. Close the left and exhale right. Inhale right. The throat stays relaxed. The sound is at the bridge of the nose. Close the right, exhale out the left, valving the left nostril. Have a little constriction, helping you to control the flow of the breath. Let's do one more round on each side. Inhale left. Close the left, exhale right. Inhale right. Close the right and exhale left. After you finish your exhale, just lower your hand, and I'd like you to take a few normal breaths and notice if and how that's different than other breathing practices. In the lecture, I mentioned how alternating the nostrils has a powerful way as well of influencing the autonomic nervous system, promoting harmony between sympathetic and parasympathetic predominance. So the effect of this 10-minute practice, and you could have done any one of these for 5 to 10 minutes, it's equalizing, balancing. Notice if your breath is coming more naturally to you now than just even 10 minutes ago. And then consider, before we open our eyes, simply consider how what you've done, this experience, this work, how it's impacting every organ of your body. Supporting what's working well. And celebrating it. So when you're ready, you can open your eyes and come back. Thank you for joining me for this Diabetes Masterclass, Harnessing the Power of the Breath. If you want to experience this more, go deeper into breathing practices and really learn how to retrain your breath and identify perhaps what it is that's actually getting in the way of you breathing efficiently. Then the diabetes breathwork practice, there's a 5-series practice that starts on the 29th of this month. It's for you. And you can go to my website and check it out. So it's a breathwork series, and you can go to the website, sorokayogatherapy.com/breathwork, and check out what the itinerary and the syllabus is. We're going to have a really nice group of people with all different types of diabetes. So a wonderful part of this is the benefit of breathing with other people like you, like me, and uniting as a community as well. Okay, so let's see. Stop share. Thank you. Let me know if you have any questions. You can reach out to me via my email. It's info@sorokayogatherapy. On Instagram, Evan_Soroka, or on Facebook, just hit me up and I'm happy to chat any questions. Thank you so much. You're welcome, Kelsey. It was nice to have you. Bye.